Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwood Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwood is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you're interested, you can contact me at hanovi at red-wind.net. That's HONOVI at red-wind.net. As this states, this presentation is not necessarily representative of the views and policies of the DOJ or OVW. All the opinions and recommendations within are those of the author. I'll now introduce our presenters. Joining us today are Drs. Tara Richards and Emily Wright. Dr. Tara Richards is an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and is a faculty lead of the Victimology and Victim Studies Research Lab. Her research focuses primarily on prevention, intervention, and system responses to sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and child abuse and neglect. Her research has been supported by the National Institute of Justice, the Office of Violence Against Women, and the Office of Victims of Crime, and she has published more than 80 articles and book chapters. Dr. Emily Wright is an Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research and Creative Activity and Professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She is also a member of the Cherokee Nation and serves on the U.S. Department of Justice Task Force on Research on Violence Against American Indian and Alaskan Native Women. Her research focuses on violence against women and children, particularly those in marginalized populations. She has published more than 90 articles, chapters, and reports on the topic, and has received funding from the National Institute of Justice and National Institutes of Health to conduct research. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box, and I'll now turn it over to Tara and Emily.
Thanks. We're really excited to be here with you guys today. So in addition to our academic credentials, I think it's also really important that we say that we're also just teachers and that we are supportive of our students and we routinely receive disclosures. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is not only based in the research, but also in our own experiences about what works and what we think about and we consider when it comes to receiving disclosures from students. So when we're done with this webinar, hopefully you guys are going to have a better understanding of what is meant by a trauma-informed response to a disclosure of sexual assault. And you'll have a better understanding of how to prepare for a student disclosure of sexual assault and what comes next for both you as a faculty or staff member and your student. So first, we need to dive into what is meant by a trauma-informed response to a disclosure of sexual assault. And we really need to begin by just briefly introducing what we mean by trauma so that we're all on the same page. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration really defines trauma as something that results, the impact, the effects of an event or a set of circumstances that an individual experiences that has a physical or emotionally harmful result. And these adverse effects or these harmful results can have a wide-reaching impacts on the individual. This could be their mental health, their physical health, their social or emotional health, or their spiritual well-being. It's widely recognized that sexual assault is a form of trauma and that as such, sexual assault can have far-reaching impacts on the victim survivors' physical and mental health, as well as their emotional and spiritual well-being. So that was really, the definition or the understanding of trauma that we are using in this webinar today. Also borrowing from SAMHSA, we are considering a trauma-informed response that really has 4 dynamics. So the 4 R's, if you will. So this trauma-informed response is going to realize the widespread impact of trauma. It's going to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. It's going to respond by, as much as possible, fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And it's going to be a response that really resists re-traumatizing the victim survivor. And here, of course, we're talking specifically about our students. So, students as victim survivors, and then institutional policies and practices at our universities. So what do we mean by a response that realizes the impacts of trauma? So here, this is really just an awareness of the fact that the trauma is real and that it impacts our students, right? So we know that victim survivors often experience humiliation, guilt, shame, feelings of betrayal, a lot of negative emotions in response to a sexual assault. And because of that, there are, real tangible consequences on their mental and physical health and well-being. And this could be things like engaging in self-harming behaviors and other risky behaviors. And research also shows that students specifically who experience a sexual assault are at an increased risk for a decline in school performance or dropping out of school altogether. So as faculty and staff and other institutional stakeholders, we really have a vested interest in trying to minimize the trauma that our students experience, because we're all working towards the same goal of keeping our students engaged and supporting their success. So we realize that the trauma is real. We realize that the impacts of the trauma. We also need to recognize or be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. We're not going to be able to go around and screen all our students for trauma, but we can use a baseline knowledge and awareness of some of the signs and symptoms of trauma, so that we can be on the lookout for students who might really be having some of these experiences, so that we can try to support them, right? So we can really be on the lookout for our students who have a change in their behavior or their engagement in class or other school activities. So you may have a student that has been attending class, has been really engaged, and then all of a sudden that just changes, right? They stop coming to class, they stop turning things in, they're late, they just kind of disappear. And, that is a sign that something's going on, right? There's been a change. And it's probably worthwhile to reach out to that student and make sure, are they okay? Which is probably something most faculty, or staff who support students in other ways do anyways, right? Because you see a change in your students' behavior and you want to make sure they're okay. So here we would just recognize that it could be something small, but it could also be something more significant, like a sexual assault or other type of traumatic event. In addition, a student might actively disclose, right? So you may not have to, do any kind of detective work to recognize that they've experienced a sexual assault, because a student may directly disclose to you in a class discussion or an assignment or an email. And so, this would of course trigger that trauma-informed response that we're talking about. So that third R is responding, right? So it's the beginning of sort of that active response. We want to respond by integrating the knowledge that we have on trauma into our policies and practices. And the easiest way to support student survivors is really integrating what we call universal precautions into our teaching practices and class policies. And what we mean by universal precaution is really just recognizing that any of our students could be experiencing this. So why not just build policies and procedures that take that into consideration just in case, right? So universal precautions really assume that all students have had this experience, right? Or have experienced some sort of trauma or will experience some sort of trauma. And that's, that's built into the policies. So for example, we can conduct our meetings with students in a welcoming and safe space on campus, right? So not in our office with the door closed. We could be, thoughtful about the placement of our furniture in the space so that, there is a clear exit and there's not things blocking the exit, from the student. So the student feels, sort of trapped in that space. So just, having some basic awareness about making sure that the space that we use to meet with students is trauma informed, right? We can also acknowledge that students might need support by including information to any off-campus or on-campus resources in our syllabus and review them with all our students at the beginning of the semester, and then perhaps at intervals during the semester, especially if we have an assignment that's going to be like a really heavy topic. So Emily and I both teach coursework on victimology topics, right? So I teach a course specific on sexual assault. She teaches, courses on child abuse and maltreatment. So understanding that our coursework, the things that we're talking about in class, might trigger our students, right? They may have experienced these, these types of trauma themselves. If we have a particularly difficult assignment or particularly, triggering course module, we can just review the policies and the resources with all of our students just in case, right? Again, assuming that it's beneficial to everybody, right? That universal precaution. And then some faculty sort of consistent with that add what, is sometimes called a trigger warning, right? Where you just, acknowledge to students that this assignment or this topic might be really difficult for some people to talk about or think about. And if it has, if there's an assignment component, you might consider offering an alternative assignment, right? Again, just thinking about how would someone who's experienced a sexual assault, how would they then experience this assignment, right? So again, creating these universal precautions so that your everyday teaching practices, your everyday policies and procedures are trauma informed. And then finally, a trauma-informed response to disclosures of sexual assault by our students resists re-traumatization, right? So the first thing what we can do is we can be prepared to receive a disclosure so that if we do, right, then we respond in a trauma-informed way, right? Like that's the baseline, first thing we can do to resist re-traumatizing our students is to be prepared, right, to receive their disclosures. And being prepared just simply means, right, considering what we would say to our students and what we wouldn't say, right? So we would want to say things like, thank you for trusting me with this information. How can I help? How can I support you? I'm really sorry this happened to you. And we wouldn't want to say things to the effect of asking about details of the sexual assault, or potentially making statements or asking questions that could be victim blaming, right? Like, why were you there? Or what were you wearing? Or who were you with? Or, asking those details, because it's not necessary for us to know those in that moment in that disclosure, and it could be taken as a sign by the student that we don't believe them, or we think that the assault is their fault, or that that we want to talk about the details, right, instead of really focusing on how we can best support them as our student. Yeah.
Okay, so what does this perhaps look like at tribal colleges and universities? All right. First, we want to talk about the impact of historical trauma first in Indigenous communities. What is historical trauma? I'm sure you all are aware of this, but we'll go over it anyways. So it's trauma that's progressive, it's vast, it's persistent. It is imposed on a group or groups of people. In this case, it's going to be Native Americans, across time and across generations. So when your native lands were taken away, right, you were forced to relocate to a new place, perhaps forced to assimilate into the broader community, the broader mainstream or white community, right? Things like this. Those are very good examples of historical trauma that's imposed on certain groups. Because of historical trauma, Native Americans, what does historical trauma do to these communities, right? It can erode the cultural beliefs, the ties to the language, the ties to the oral histories, the beliefs and recipes even for certain foods. In general, it can erode the trust of outsiders as well. And so when you think about the experience of sexual assault and a student's decision to respond or disclose it, you must understand how historical trauma is pervasive potentially in their lives, and at least at the TCU level, at the university or college level, that it is playing a part. So that's one aspect. Another one is to understand that research shows that violence and victimization rates are higher among Native groups. Okay, that does not mean that violence, and particularly violence against women and children, are Indigenous values, because they are not. But what we see from a research standpoint is that Native Americans are exposed to more on higher levels of violence than other groups. So these two things in combination, historical trauma and exposure to violence and victimization, means that faculty and staff who work at tribal colleges and universities are fairly likely to be in contact with students who have experienced some form of sexual assault. And not only are they more likely to be in contact with these students, but the students' responses, as well as how they're whether they decide to disclose, how they decide to do it, and the resources that are available to them may look different, may be deeper, may be wider in terms of the impact of trauma on these students. So we want you to keep those issues in mind. So I think it's important then that we understand recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in tribal colleges and universities. We should say that, empirically speaking, from a research standpoint, we actually don't know yet if the symptoms of trauma are all that different among Indigenous students than they are among white or other race and ethnicity groups. But we suspect that they could be for at least two reasons. The first one is that the culture that they come from could impact their understanding of what trauma actually is, right? And what trauma is not. And the other issue is that their cultural traditions and expectations may differ regarding whether they should disclose or even talk about the trauma that they've experienced. We've been to Native communities where community members just simply say, our tribe is not ready to talk about sexual assault among family members or among youth. We're just not there yet. So that is a cultural sort of expectation that certainly might impact whether a student is willing to disclose and even how they do so. So what this slide really, we want to kind of get you to think about a few things, and then we're going to circle back to these issues in the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. One of the things we've been thinking a lot about is how tribal colleges and universities can be more responsive to their students who are experiencing or who have experienced victimization. But not only how they can be more responsive, but how they can be responsive in a culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive way. Because what the research traditionally sort of tells us is all derived from primarily research on mainstream campuses, right? Primarily white
students,
campuses and white students. And so one of the things we've been thinking through is how we might learn from some of these like universal precautions or these trauma-informed guidelines and suggestions, but understand that they could be better utilized and employed in at tribal colleges and universities if they were more culturally sensitive and more culturally appropriate. So think about how these universal precautions that Dr. Richards talked about, how they might be changed or tweaked to be more culturally appropriate. One thing she talked about is having, for instance, a link or a sort of a referral to outside resources that could be helpful for this student. Well, are there tribal resources that could be helpful for this student? That's an example of sort of what we're talking about. We have talked to faculty and staff at TCUs and learned that a lot of them are already thinking about the impact of trauma on their students. A lot of them already understand that they themselves might experience trauma as a result of having a student disclose their event to them. And so I think reaching out to and incorporating faculty and staff, as well as students, to get an understanding of, from their perspective, how can these responses be more culturally centered would be helpful and important, as well as to understand their level of knowledge of the resources and policies and guidelines that each tribal college has, because not everybody is equally as knowledgeable about the policies and procedures that that exist and the resources that exist across universities. So that's an important thing to think about as well. And then also, so many TCUs have very strong mission and value statements that guide the administration of their university. And it's so wonderful to see. And so one of the things that we've thought about is how can these mission and value statements sort of thread through the policies and procedures and guidelines and responses to sexual assault from the institutional level. And again, how much of that do faculty and staff know and understand at the institutional level? So I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Yeah. Okay, so those are really sort of the four R's, the four components of what we see as a trauma-informed response to disclosures of sexual assault. So the next step is really to think about how to prepare for a student disclosure of sexual assault and what comes after a student discloses, right? Because you can be sort of armed with knowledge about a trauma-informed response, but there are, clearly policies and procedures that guide you and as a faculty or staff or other institutional stakeholder, right? You have to work within the institutional policies that you have at your tribal college or university. So again, starting with that place of coming from a trauma-informed perspective, we recognize that survivor empowerment, voice, and choice are key principles of a trauma-informed response. So thinking about the fact that a sexual assault really robs that victim survivor of their power and control, right? So how can we, in the disclosure process and anything that comes after, help restore a survivor's power, choice, autonomy, and voice? Doing that should always be a key goal of anything that we do to support a student survivor. So that, when we're thinking about the disclosure process and how to respond, we really want to prioritize restoring and maximizing the survivor's control of the information about their sexual assault and any response to it. We really want to do our best so that this is their choice, anything is their choice, and that they really, drive everything, right? So with this goal in mind, faculty and staff need to know whether or not they are mandatory reporters at their TCU. So many of you probably already know that given guidance around Title IX, there are many institutions have sort of deemed all faculty and staff at the university as a mandatory reporter, which means that you must report any information about an alleged sexual assault, as well as other forms of sexual harassment, dating violence, domestic violence, or stalking to your Title IX coordinator as part of the mandate of under Title IX. Now, the Department of Education gives universities a choice. So they've left it up to individual schools, to colleges and universities, so not K through 12, but they have left it up to individual colleges and universities to decide who on campus is a mandatory reporter. But it's important to understand that at many universities, the administration has decided that all faculty and staff are going to be mandatory reporters. That's the policy. So the first thing really to understand is, are you a mandatory reporter? Because if you are, then this limits, right? This inherently limits your ability to provide that full survivor choice once they disclose, right? Because if you're a mandatory reporter and a student discloses to you, you must, right? You must then disclose that information to your Title IX coordinator. So the first step is really understanding, are you a mandatory reporter at your institution or not? So for faculty and staff who are mandatory reporters, in service to this goal of victim survivor's choice, it's really important that your students understand that you are a mandatory reporter, and hopefully before they disclose to you, because there's nothing worse than having a student disclose that they've been a victim of sexual assault and then having to tell them, thank you so much for trusting me with this information. Unfortunately, I have to tell somebody else, right? And of course, they were not aware of that. They trusted you. They weren't expecting to have this personal information, potentially the very worst moment of their entire life, shared with somebody else. And likely somebody they don't know, because most students don't know the Title IX coordinator, right? It's some administrator in some office that they may not even know exists on campus. So one of the things that we that we do, and that is a potential suggestion to making sure that students understand the process around mandatory reporting on campus, is for faculty who are mandatory reporters to include a statement informing students that they are mandatory reporters in their syllabus and explaining what that means for students. And faculty can also include information on confidential support providers on campus and off-campus resources in their syllabus as well, because the syllabus statement isn't a statement that basically says, I'm a mandatory reporter, don't tell me anything. It's a statement that explains to students that, in service to, making sure that students are protected from, that the campus is as safe as possible, right? That students are supported, that campus has decided that, all faculty and staff are mandatory reporters, with the goal of making sure that all students are connected to the Title IX coordinator. But if that's not something you're interested in doing right now, then here are some other ways that you can seek support that are confidential. So we will post this, or Redwind will post this webinar. So you'll see that I have some hot links here. We have some hot links here, including an example syllabus statement that includes sort of all the important components that could easily be tweaked for your tribal college or university. But again, just sort of giving you an example of what this might look like. And then, of course, the resources below, the national resources below, Strong Hearts Native Helpline, that is, an Indigenous specific national resource, and then the National Sexual Assault Helpline is the national hotline, because we of course want to give students choices, and students may feel more comfortable seeking a resource that's off campus, and depending on how small your community is, depending on how rural your community is, seeking a resource off campus that's still in your community may not feel to the student like there is a very high level of confidentiality, right? Students may want to seek services or support from outside the community, and that's where a national hotline could be really helpful. So whether or not you are a mandatory reporter, it's really helpful in sort of preparing to receive a student disclosure for you to know sort of some basic information about the resources and process on your campus. So first and foremost, it's really helpful for you to know who serves as your Title IX coordinator and where they're located on campus, right? Because if you're a mandatory reporter, obviously you're going to need to, to get information to this person. But also, even if you're not, your student may want to seek services or to report to the Title IX coordinator. And it's really nice. Students really are best served when they can get accurate and easy information from you, the faculty member that they disclose to, right? Because they're disclosing to you, seeking support from you. And if you have some of the basic answers to their questions, it can be really comforting, right? And then also, if you can just have a basic understanding of the process for reporting to the Title IX coordinator and what will happen if a student makes a report, that can also really help ease the student's mind, because they may want to know, well, if I go and I report this, what's going to happen? And it's going to feel a lot better for the student and for you, the person who, is committed to your students and wants to support them, to have those answers, right? Instead of having to say, let me make a phone call, or let me get back to you, right? So just having a really basic understanding, so that you can respond not just with empathy and with support, but also with that important information, that's going to really best serve your students and allow them to make informed choices about what to do next. So lastly, we don't want to forget about self-care, because receiving disclosures and supporting your students and responding when a student discloses sexual assault is emotional labor, and it can be difficult work, and it can really take a toll on your well-being. And it can potentially alter the way you see, your students or your campuses, right? It can impact your own worldview and your own, your own well-being. And we also understand, and I know Emily will talk a little bit more about this, that as faculty and staff, you are not immune to trauma yourself. And that many of us who go into this work have had our own either personal experiences or secondary experiences with sexual assault and other trauma. And so receiving a disclosure from a student can be triggering as well. So we want to acknowledge the emotional labor that this constitutes, and we want to acknowledge the role strain that faculty, especially faculty, but faculty, staff, other stakeholders feel when a student reports. Because as a teacher, when you receive a student disclosure, you are in this position where you can listen, you can support, you can help them access resources, but you can't actually be their counselor. You can't, even if you're a trained psychologist or a social worker, right? You're their teacher, you're their faculty member, and you have to stay in that role. So we really invite you to also consider and think about resources that are available to you for self-care, and how you might sort of start to negotiate your own role as a faculty member if you start receiving a lot of disclosures, because this is emotional labor, and it's not labor or work or service as a faculty member that is readily recognized by chairs and deans and administrators in thinking about promotions or raises or the sort of your productivity, if you will. But in fact, it takes a lot of work. And so, these are also things that we should be thinking about when we're considering how to respond to student disclosures of sexual assault.
Absolutely. So, okay, so this is a little bit of thinking work on your part. We're going to open it up to Q&A in just a second. I want to give you some things to think about as before we open it up to Q&A. So how might some of these issues look or work differently at tribal colleges and universities? First, think about resources, and particularly the level of resources that are available. So first and foremost, has your college or university developed policies and procedures specifically responding to sexual assault for students? Does your Title IX coordinator wear many hats? We have seen this, especially on smaller campuses, where resources might be tight and personnel might be tight. So you might have a Title IX coordinator who is also a counselor or also an administrator in a different capacity of some sort. So how many hats does your Title IX coordinator wear, and how might that impact their ability to respond to disclosures of sexual assault. And that could just be in terms of limited time, right? That's like a basic thing. We talked a little bit about confidentiality, I believe. Are there confidential resources on campus? Again, with smaller colleges and universities, and with tighter knit communities, which we do tend to see among Native groups, this can be a little bit of an issue in terms of how easy it is to break confidentiality, or how many people know, both on campus and in the community, right? So that's an important thing to consider. What about a lot of TCUs are not in the main city center across the nation. So how far do students or administrators, faculty, and staff, whoever it is that's trying to procure the resources, how far do they have to travel to get resources that are off campus? There are some campuses that might outsource response or resources, like victim advocacy or something like that. They don't have it on campus, so they sort of outsource it to the next location. Well, how far away is that? That's going to tell you a lot about how likely your student population is to actually access those resources, right? If it's really terribly hard for them to gain access to, they may not do it. And then think about resources that are specifically dedicated to faculty and staff because of that secondary trauma that we talk about, because of the emotional labor that can occur when students disclose to faculty or staff. What resources are available for them that's provided by the university? We run into jurisdictional complications more so than not when we're working with Native communities, whether that's responding to certain types of crime and victimization, or just communicating with the local law enforcement jurisdiction. Sometimes these jurisdictional gaps can be quite great. So think about whether or not your community has trusted law enforcement officers that are available and responsive. These can be tribal law enforcement officers, or they can be non-tribal law enforcement officers. But how likely is it that somebody from the community would reach out to law enforcement to report an assault? This is that can tell you a lot about where you need to kind of bridge gaps in the response. And finally, we'll leave this to open our Q&A session here, is how can these universal responses that we've talked about be tailored to be more specifically culturally sensitive and appropriate? How can they be tailored to match or align with the mission and the values of the TCU and the local tribe? And with that, I think we're going to open it up for questions. And thank you so much for your time.
Do you want to stop sharing the screen?
Oh, yeah, I can. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. There. Does anybody have hands, Q&A?
If you have any questions, you can put them into the chat box, or you can click the little raise hand icon and we will be able to see that.
And we're always open to hearing about the policies, procedures, responses that you guys might have at your institution.
Yes. So we will absolutely make sure that a copy of this webinar is provided. So it's being recorded, and I'm guessing Red Wind will send this out to all the participants. Is that correct?
Yes. So we'll send out a PDF version of the presentation, and then we will also be posting the recording of this on our YouTube page.
Awesome. Yeah, and we'll be happy to archive it on UNO's website as well once Red Wind gets it posted. So there'll be lots of opportunities to find it. Great.
Hanovi, did we include our emails in our bios or anything? I don't think it was on our PowerPoint.
I do not believe that was part of the introduction. No.
Okay. Well, I mean, we work really well with Red Wind. So if any of the participants here have want to try to get in touch with us, I think Tara's going to leave our information in the chat.
Yes, I can put our email addresses in the chat as well.
But you can always reach out to Red Wind. They might know our emails by heart at this point.
Yeah. Are you just
EM Wright?
Oh, okay. Huh, that's interesting.
I know. I've always thought yours was weird.
Okay, there we go. There's our email addresses. I think there's. Oh, I don't know.
Is that us?
Okay.
You want to read that?
Mm-hmm. Okay. There is always confidentiality issues with small schools. Do you all know how other small schools are handling this, especially when the Title IX coordinator wears many hats? There's more to this question. This is just a start. Sure. So in terms of confidentiality issues here, I'm just going to pull this back up so that I make sure that, and Emily can definitely jump in as well. So I'll try to answer this as kind of general, and feel free to give me more details if you're wanting something really specific. So in terms of confidentiality of the reporting to the Title IX coordinator, there should be an expectation of confidentiality when when a student reports. If you're a faculty member and you report to the Title IX coordinator, really your role is to report to the Title IX coordinator, that you have, you've been given some information that, there's been potentially a sexual assault or an incident of dating violence or domestic violence, that, and you're going to pass, the victim survivor's name, or perhaps you heard about this from another student. You may not even know who the potential victim survivor is, right? Or so in Title IX speak, it's the complainant, right? So the victim survivor or alleged victim survivor is the complainant, and the alleged perpetrator is the respondent. So you may not even know who the perpetrator, or who the complainant or the respondent is, right? You may have just heard from one of your students that, there was a party that weekend and somebody was assaulted, right? And by having that level of information, if you're a mandatory reporter, you're mandated to tell the Title IX coordinator, hey, this thing happened. And if there's no details about who the person is, that's really all the Title IX coordinator can do, is really just sort of record that they have that information, in case later somebody else reports the same type of information, or maybe, a potential witness or a potential, complainant comes forward. So there should be a level of confidentiality that's expected from the Title IX coordinator, no matter how many hats they wear. That's part of the job, right? Is keeping that information confidential. The only information that should ever be released is really in terms of the basic reporting that your institution has to do for clarity in terms of the annual security reports. This might change a little bit if there's a decision that there's an imminent threat to campus. If there's an imminent threat to campus, then the Title IX coordinator may have to make some decisions about, do I, even if the complainant doesn't want to move forward, do I still reach out to that respondent or potential respondent because I think that we might have a student on campus that has that is a threat to other students, right? So, that is sort of some basic information on, confidentiality. But if we're talking more about supportive resources, then, there may, what I would say is that a lot of small schools don't have confidential resources on campus, and that they really are reliant on either community providers. So, in the sort of TCU paradigm, right, is there, a sexual assault or domestic violence advocate that, is affiliated with the tribe, or, is there, a community provider that's in the sort of closest, city or town off the reservation, or outside of the area where the tribal college or university is, that can coordinate with the campus. So we've seen really good results from developing memorandums of understanding, not specific to TCUs, but just other small campuses that just don't have the personnel to have a confidential support provider on campus, but really reaching out to that local rape crisis center or domestic violence shelter and developing an MOU so that there is this easy and streamlined process for students to contact that support provider, and really kind of just giving them a heads up, the support provider, the community support provider, that like, we don't have anybody on campus, so we're going to be sending our students to you. Please know that is going to be happening. We're going to list your phone number and your name and your, email address on our campus website, or we're going to put them on the flyers that we're doing for this awareness event. So really thinking about, is there anything that's in the community off campus that can support like an official relationship, right? Even though they're not on campus, they're not a part of the university. Can there be like an official relationship that's developed through an MOU or some kind of cooperative agreement, so that the community-based provider knows what the TCU is expecting, and the TCU has some understanding of what the student is going to get if they go there. Because, you always fear, as, when you get into that kind of relationship, what's going to happen if I send my student to this organization? They have a terrible experience, and then they don't get the support they need, and it shuts them down, right? They're scared to ever tell anybody else because they've had this super negative experience. So, if there's a way to develop that relationship, in a way that is, more official, so that both parties really have a good understanding of what's going to happen. And I guess the last point in this question, even the development of those relationships can become difficult if the Title IX coordinator wears a lot of hats and they don't have a lot of time to do these things. And, what I think we would both say, and I mean, Emily, definitely jump in. I mean, Emily's in an administrative position, a half-time administrative position for our university. And I think that if there are things that your Title IX coordinator needs to do, or if you are a Title IX coordinator and you are on this call, I think it may be that the Title IX coordinator just has to say to, whoever that direct supervisor is, that this is really important for our students. We have these gaps, or I don't even know what our gaps are because I don't have time to do this. And really try to build some buy-in on campus that this is potentially just as important as the academic mission, because this is directly related to student academic success.
Yeah.
And that it might be that the Title IX coordinator can't bear it alone, and there needs to potentially be more of a working group. And then I would also say, look to our good friends at Redwind, because they're a fantastic resource and they've done a lot of the heavy lifting already in terms of identifying best practices and thinking about the holistic response for TCUs. So don't reinvent the wheel. Go to Redwind and see what they can provide, for you guys without, having to do anything new.
Yeah, I've known Title IX coordinators at mainstream, primarily white universities, and they have resigned within 18 months because even they don't have the resources that they feel their unit needs. And so, and they get overwhelmed and frustrated. And a lot of times the Title IX, at this point, this was a few years ago, but that administrative position took so much time and effort, and they weren't full-time Title IX, coordinators. So I can only imagine how, if you're having resource issues at mainstream colleges and universities, how you might, how that might translate to TCUs that have fewer people, that are smaller. So,
other questions or thoughts about that? Oh yeah. Okay. One more question. What is your take on peer advocates for sexual assault? So I think it depends on if they are educational in capacity or if they are there to provide direct services, right? So I think that educational models, peer advocate educational models, I think can be really effective. I mean, Dr. Wright and I actually have been sort of developing this, thinking about this with Redwind for not just sexual assault, but sort of victim advocacy more generally for TCUs, understanding the personnel limitations. And so, I think that peer advocates can be, really helpful in terms of, supporting education and awareness and primary prevention and bystander intervention training, all of those things on campus. In terms of providing direct supports, as well as providing educational advocacy, there is a pretty significant supervision component that has to happen and training component for those advocates. So what we would really like to see is, a model that is that has a really the development of a model that TCUs can use, where the advocates, the student advocates are trained well, and then they can then train the next generation, right? So that while there's still a significant supervision component by, someone in a faculty or staff or administrative role on campus, there is some sort of self-sustainment in the model so that, new peer advocates can sort of lean on and be trained in some capacity by the ones that came before them. But in terms of sort of direct services, there is, most folks that are in those roles are social workers or mental health counselors. And so you could definitely develop a model on your campus for students in those disciplines that, are moving into sort of clinical hours. But again, that takes sort of a specific, so some specifics on that campus that would allow for that. And then of course, you might run into that confidentiality piece, right? Because if you're a student on that campus and you are, especially at a TCU where there's only several hundred students, it's likely that all students or many students know each other, or there's very small degrees of separation between different student groups. And I think that becomes very difficult. I think that would become very difficult. What, Emily and I really kind of thought about is, could a model, sort of a consortium model exist where, students are being trained to then help support other students in a remote way at another school, right? So that you do have, you're not having to deal with the same level of issues around confidentiality. But of course, these are all sort of, innovations in the making. I mean, these are unfortunately not models that exist right now. But I think those potentially are some creative future solutions for smaller campuses, because the finite resource issue is real, and I don't think is going away.
Good questions.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Fantastic.
We love a forum to just continue to talk.
Any other questions, or, we'd be happy to hear about something that's working really well on your campus, or something that's not working well. And, we won't obviously read who the comment is coming from. So, feel free to put the comment or question just to the panelists, and we're happy to provide a forum for discussion on something specific.
Give a few more seconds.
Okay. Can't tell if this is. Oh, it's just.
Looks like we just have a final comment. Cultural roles often lead to everyone wanting to be the counselor.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah, we've kind of seen that. Absolutely. It's I think it's a strength of Native communities. They're very supportive and interconnected, and those are things that, we talk about the confidentiality issues and that being a problem, but I think we also need to remind ourselves that interconnectedness is really a resiliency issue. It's a strength issue, and perhaps instead of thinking of it too much in terms of in a negative light, we should really build upon the strengths that it provides.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we got an affirmation.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Well, if no one else has any questions, we will wrap up. Thank you both for joining me today. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenters. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, guys.